Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Israeli government spokesman Eylon Levy. This is day 70 of the October 7th war. Lots of updates today, and then I will take your questions. We'll start with the latest figures. To date, over 1,200 victims of the 10/7 massacre have been identified, and 10,939 people have since been evacuated to hospitals since the start of this war. Hamas has fired over 12,500 rockets at Israeli communities, with over 2,000 misfiring, the large majority falling inside Gaza and causing untold damage and casualties there. The IDF has notified families of the deaths of 449 soldiers. IDF fatalities have risen by 4 since yesterday's update. That includes 2 soldiers who fell in battle over the last 24 hours. Sergeant Oz Shmuel Aradi, aged only 19, and Sergeant First Class Reserves Shai Uriel Pizem, who became a father only 3 weeks ago. And that death toll includes 2 19-year-old soldiers who were abducted on 10/7 and murdered in captivity, and whose bodies the IDF only recently rescued and recovered from Gaza, Corporal Nick Bizer and the late Sergeant Ron Sherman. Our thoughts are with their families at this impossible time of grief. An update on the hostage crisis. Hamas is still holding 132 people hostage since 10/7, in addition to 4 hostages from before. That hostage count has been revised down by 3 since yesterday's update. In addition to recovering the bodies of murdered hostages Corporal Nick Bizer and Sergeant Ron Sherman, the IDF also recovered the body of dual Israeli-French national Elia Toledano, aged 28, who was abducted from the Nova Music Festival and murdered in Hamas captivity. Among the remaining 132 hostages in the Hamas terror dungeons are 113 males and 19 females. There are 2 children under 18, the Bibas infants, and 10 people over 75. 121 of the hostages are Israelis, another 11 foreign nationals. Of the 132 hostages, 20 have since been murdered, and Hamas is holding their bodies hostage. There are 110 survivors of Hamas captivity, 86 Israelis and 24 foreigners. A further 8 hostages were murdered in captivity, with their bodies since repatriated. There are still 5 missing persons since 10/7. Some operational updates. Israeli forces continue to target Hamas terrorists in their strongholds, even as they fight in civilian dress out of civilian buildings. In northern Gaza, IDF forces have secured and destroyed the Hamas Shaja'iyah battalion's command and control center, having already eliminated the battalion's commander and then his replacement. In Khan Yunis, IDF troops have been conducting targeted raids on terror infrastructure, killing terrorists, destroying weapons compounds, and locating tunnel shafts containing motorbikes used in the 10/7 massacre. Israel continues to target Hamas terrorists hiding underground, turning their terror tunnels into death traps. Last night, the IDF and Shin Bet released special footage from an operation by the Combat Engineering Yahalom unit to kill terrorists in a major tunnel. This week, the Israeli Air Force has also targeted and destroyed Hamas military assets located along the border between Gaza and Egypt. Hamas had used those assets to smuggle weapons into Gaza, and their destruction will now hinder Hamas's attempts to rearm. There will be no hiding place for the 10/7 monsters. Humanitarian update. The Kerem Shalom crossing has been open since December 12th for inspections of aid trucks, in addition to Nitzana. That move makes it possible to more than double shipments of humanitarian necessities into Gaza. In recent days, equipment and personnel have also entered for the Emirati and Jordanian field hospitals. It will of course be possible to expedite aid shipments to civilians in Gaza if Hamas stops stealing it, and if the UN is able to distribute it at the pace that Israel is inspecting it. An update from the northern front. Hezbollah continues its unprovoked aggression against Israeli communities. Since October 7th, Hezbollah has fired hundreds of rockets and missiles at Israel from Lebanon, in flagrant violation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701. Its entire presence south of the Litani River is a flagrant violation of that resolution, by the way. 1 in 5 of those Hezbollah rockets has fallen short inside Lebanese territory, calling unknown damage to Lebanese civilians as they try to inflict maximum damage on Israeli civilians. The IDF will continue to defend Israel's northern border against any threat, striking and destroying Hezbollah terror infrastructure and operatives in Lebanon. We repeat our consistent warning: if Hezbollah drags Israel into a full-scale war, which we do not want, it will be making the mistake of a lifetime, and the consequences for both Hezbollah and Lebanon will be severe. Some diplomatic updates. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met yesterday with our friend US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. The Prime Minister expressed his great appreciation for the US support for Israel in the supply of munitions needed to defeat Hamas after 10/7, blocking attempts at the UN to try to keep Hamas in power, and assisting in securing the return of our hostages. Prime Minister Netanyahu reaffirmed that Israel stands more determined than ever to continue fighting until we achieve our common goals with our American allies: the elimination of Hamas and the release of the hostages. In other words, total victory. The Prime Minister and Mr. Sullivan also discussed the continuation of humanitarian assistance to the non-combatant population in Gaza and threats to the Israeli people from the north and south from proxy forces of Iran's axis of evil. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also met yesterday with the president of the Red Cross, Mirjana Spoljaric. In their meeting, he gave her a box of vital medicines for the hostages in Gaza and demanded that the Red Cross do its job and deliver it to them. The Prime Minister told Mrs. Spoljaric about Hamas's brutal atrocities on 10/7 and the inhumane conditions of the Hamas terror dungeons. The Prime Minister expressed his gratitude for the Red Cross's help in securing the release of hostages and criticized certain statements coming out of the agency which failed to make the distinction between Hamas's deliberate and systematic acts of murder and the unintended casualties in this war which Hamas started and is waging out of urban areas, trying to use civilians as human shields. The Red Cross must demand unconditional access to those vulnerable hostages, not subject to practical details to be agreed with Hamas, as the Red Cross president suggested. We condemn in the strongest possible terms the shameful statements by international officials trying to deflect blame onto Israel to cover up the fact that they have been covering up for Hamas. Specifically, we wish to call out the Red Cross's chief legal officer, Cordula Drog, who falsely claimed that Israel is almost totally depriving civilians in Gaza of food, water, and medical supplies. Let's be clear, Dr. Droga is not telling the truth. Israel has excess capacity to inspect aid trucks and has placed zero restrictions on the entry of humanitarian necessities into Gaza. The backlog is at the Rafah crossing and inside Gaza, with UN agencies unable to distribute aid at the pace that Israel is inspecting it, and of course with Hamas stealing that aid. Sadly, the Red Cross is doing everything to avoid admitting that Hamas steals aid and wages war from inside hospitals. That must change. These statements also clearly go against the Red Cross's own principles of neutrality and confidentiality. While the Red Cross openly criticizes Israel, a democratic state with a law-abiding military, it has yet to utter one condemnation of Hamas's systematic violations of international law, including its militarization of the very hospitals that the Red Cross funds and works at. How could they not know? And now that they do know, why do they not speak out? It's not particularly difficult. Finally, a stark reminder of Hamas's threat to global security. Yesterday, security agencies in Denmark thwarted a terror attack that would have killed innocent civilians on European soil, arresting 7 terrorists acting on behalf of Hamas. Since 10/7, Hamas has been stepping up its attempts to expand its attacks against Israelis, Jews, and other Western targets around the world. Israel is fighting on the front lines of humanity, and Hamas is coming for you too. The West is next. The same monsters who intentionally and methodically burned, beheaded, and raped Israelis on 10/7 would gladly globalize their intifada, as protesters on campuses and streets around the West are calling for. They aim to sow terror on the streets of Western capitals, and the whole world must be vigilant and stand in solidarity with us as we battle our common enemy, which wants all of us alike dead. That comes to the end of today's update. We'll now take your questions through the chat, please.
First question from Adam Scott Bellos, the Israel Innovation Fund. It seems like more daylight is being seen between the United States and Israel when it comes to this war. And now recently President Biden stated that we have been indiscriminately bombing Gaza. And CNN just released a report that almost 40% of our bombs are unguided, quoting many people who criticize this tactic as well. Does the Prime Minister's office have any comment about these unguided bombs, or the recent remarks coming out of the White House related to this?
Thank you, Adam, for your questions. As for your first question about the timing of this war, Israel and the United States are fully aligned on our mission to destroy Hamas. The only clock that matters is that every second that Hamas still exists after 10/7, it is a ticking time bomb. And the best way for our allies to expedite an end to this war, which Hamas started, is to stand by us as we push for total victory over Hamas, the destruction of Hamas, using swift, decisive, and overwhelming force in the face of pure evil. As for your question about the CNN report about quote-unquote dumb bombs, that's a classic example of a sensationalist headline with a buried lead, because the very same officials the CNN is quoting in that report say that Israel is using these munitions, using a tactic that makes them just as precise as guided munitions. So you have a headline there that is accusing Israel of being indiscriminate or careless in its targeting of Hamas, while you have to go about 12 paragraphs down to say that it vindicates the claim that Israel has been making all along, that we are using munitions against Hamas with unprecedented precision, using all of our munitions in a way that is precise in order to target the Hamas terror monsters responsible for 10/7, who are now planning another attack and doing everything we can, going further than any military in history, to try to avoid harm to civilians, despite Hamas's best efforts to maximize civilian casualties, because that's part of Hamas's sick ploy, to maximize casualties, try to get international sympathy, to garner diplomatic pressure to try to stop Israel defending itself, and we're going to continue with that unprecedented precision all the way to total victory.
Question from Yunko Yasmin Utmaskin. How many dead bodies have been found this week?
Yonko, I don't have an exact breakdown for you based on a week-by-week basis. We can tell you that just in the last 24 hours, we've informed the public of 3 bodies that we returned from Hamas captivity. Corporal Nick Beiser and Sergeant Ron Sherman, who were abducted on October 7th, and Ilya Toledano, age 28, abducted from the Nova Music Festival. That brings us to 8 hostages who were murdered in captivity and their bodies since repatriated, and Hamas is currently holding on to the bodies of 20 hostages. Out of those 132, 20 hostages we know have since been murdered in captivity, and Hamas is holding their bodies for a ransom in sick violation of humanitarian law and every norm of humanity.
A question from Bernard Mordler from Bernie News Network. In recent updates from our sources in Gaza, there have been reports that Hamas operatives are shooting individuals trying to access food from the aid trucks. In this context, could you inform us about the organizations or entities responsible for ensuring that international aid reaches Gaza's civilians? Also, is the IDF's involvement limited to just inspecting aid for contraband? Or do they play a more active role in distribution process to prevent such incidents?
You're right to draw attention to these horrific images that we're seeing of Hamas gunmen requisitioning aid shipments inside the Gaza Strip to make sure that their fighters remain well-fed and well-stocked at the expense of civilians who need that aid. We think it is shameful that the agencies involved in distributing that aid, whether it's UNRWA, Enough Said, or other agencies, have not a word of criticism or condemnation against Hamas for stealing that aid. And instead they try to deflect blame onto the State of Israel, which has placed 0 restrictions on the import of humanitarian aid and has more than doubled capacities. We see that as an attempt to deflect blame to account for their own failures and to cover up for the fact that Hamas is stealing aid. We genuinely ask, we're going blue in the face asking, what is so difficult for the international agencies that are feigning concern for civilians in Gaza to condemn the terror organization that runs Gaza stealing that aid? Israel inspects aid at the Nitzana and Kerem Shalom crossings. We have to scan those trucks to make sure that Hamas isn't trying to smuggle in weapons. And from there, they go to the Rafah border crossing with Egypt. They enter Gaza and are then passed on to UN agencies on the ground responsible for distributing that aid. And we expect them to do a better job distributing the aid so we can get much more in through Rafah. The aid is there, they need to do a better job. And we expect clear and unequivocal condemnations of Hamas for stealing that aid at the expense of the civilians in Gaza who need it. Because we do not want to see civilians in Gaza paying any more of a price for Hamas's evil decision to wage war with the October 7th massacre, fight that war from inside densely populated areas it is trying to prevent from evacuating, shifting that war into the humanitarian zone. Again, not a word of condemnation from the UN about Hamas exploiting a humanitarian zone to shoot rockets. And now, as we see, stealing aid from the people who, as these agencies constantly remind us, desperately need it.
Question from Joel Pollock, Breitbart News. Jake Sullivan said yesterday that Israel must wrap up intense fighting in weeks, not months. Does Israel believe that the Biden administration is imposing a political calendar on the war because of the upcoming US presidential election?
Joel, as I said in response to the previous question, Israel and the United States are fully aligned on the mission to destroy Hamas. That has been consistent since 10/7. The only clock that matters is that every second Hamas still exists after 10/7. It is a ticking time bomb that we must defuse, or it will explode in our faces again. And the best way for our allies to expedite an end to this war, which Hamas started, and we also want to see over, but needs to be over with the end of Hamas, is to stand by us as we push for total victory over Hamas, the total destruction of Hamas, using swift, decisive, and overwhelming force in the face of what the United States has defined as pure evil.
Question from Jim Williams, Zenger International News Service, Washington, D.C. Does the Israeli government share the view of the US that Israel is clearly winning the war against Hamas, but is Israel, and the US, as the US did in Afghanistan, losing the messaging war on the world stage by how Israel is fighting the war in Gaza and how it's being reported?
First of all, Israel is clearly winning the war right now. Under the direction of Prime Minister Netanyahu and the war cabinet, we are making major achievements towards achieving the goals of this war. We have already significantly degraded Hamas's capabilities inside Gaza. We see that with the dramatic drop in rocket fire towards Israel. We see that with the destruction of their military assets. We see that with the mass surrender of Hamas terrorists. Just yesterday, 70 emerging from the Kamal Adwan hospital in northern Gaza. We've made large strides towards the other goal of the war of bringing back the hostages, with 110 coming back to Israel. Not enough. We still need to bring back the other 132, and we are committed to that pledge of no one left behind. And our job is to remind the world of exactly what it knew on 10/7 as news began to emerge of the acts of burning, beheading, and rape during Hamas's systematic extermination of Israeli civilians. As former President Obama said on the morning of 10/7, as the news was just beginning to come out, the United States and the world must stand firmly by Israel as it dismantles Hamas. They know that to be true. They've known that to be true since 10/7. They know it to be true despite Hamas's best efforts to generate diplomatic pressure through creating international sympathy by deliberately manufacturing a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And we're going to continue shining a spotlight on Hamas's crimes against humanity and its war crimes, and on our unprecedented efforts to try to keep civilians on the other side safe as we prosecute what is probably the quintessential example of a just war in the 21st century. We did not start this war. We did not want this war. We did not expect this war. Hamas declared this war against us, and we will continue with our defensive campaign until we achieve total victory.
Question from Yunko Yasmin Utmaskin from Kyodo News regarding the hostages and missing persons families forum notice that shock among the families of the hostages at the rejection of the director of the Mossad's proposal to travel to Qatar to formulate a new hostage deal. Do you have any comment on this?
We have no comment on negotiations surrounding the return of the hostages. You'll appreciate this is a sensitive situation and human lives hang in the balance, and the less we say, the better. But we reaffirm the state of Israel is doing everything it can in order to bring those hostages home safe and sound, immediately and unconditionally, to ensure they have access to the Red Cross, which has not been doing enough to secure access to those hostages, and we will consider and continue with every avenue in order to get those hostages home. You know, one thing maybe people don't realize around the world, Israel is such a small country that this is a very personal issue for all of us. 250 hostages in a country of 10 million people means that everyone knows at least someone who has had someone stolen from them. And we repeat our pledge that we will leave no one left behind and that none of us are free till all of them are free. And that's why, like so many Israelis, I have around my own neck this dog tag in solidarity with the hostages that says on it, "Bring them home now." And in Hebrew, "Halev shelanu shavui be'aza," our hearts are still trapped in Gaza.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Have a safe weekend. Keep safe. We'll update you on the timing of the next briefing. And good Shabbos, everyone. Thank you.